Hey everybody, I'm just re-recording this last little bit of chapter 14 lecture. I got a notice at the end of the recording that I had lost internet connection, I guess, so the first recording got cut off kind of halfway through this slide, or at least it stopped sharing my screen, and I didn't realize that till the end. So this is sort of an unexpected part 2 for chapter 14. So if you watched the first part, I kind of went through this slide, and it was right at the end that I think my internet connectivity started to falter a little bit. So what I was saying was just kind of going through the different types of exercise, basically the different levels of intensity for running. So from a short dead sprint to running one full length of the track, to a 1 mile race, to a 6 mile race, to the marathon. And I was pointing out the different energy substrates. And I said in the marathon, we're still actually using primarily carbohydrate. We will use a bit of fat. And then I was highlighting this 5% other. And if you read the short description under marathon, it tells us that we do actually break down a little bit of body protein to release amino acids so that we can convert amino acids to glucose to contribute to the energy supply for the run. And now this is really only due to the fact that marathons are such long endurance and still a relatively high intensity, kind of a moderate to vigorous intensity depending on what the person's doing. A marathon is different from hiking in that hiking is at a slower, more moderate pace and would similarly go on for several hours, but could even potentially double the duration of a marathon. So in hiking, we see 5 to 7 hours of hiking. We're going to see primarily fat burning for the energy substrate, and then less than half of the energy would be supplied by carbohydrate. This slide is kind of showing the same thing, but in chart form. So just showing on the y-axis for the chart on the left, the percentage contribution of carbohydrate or fat based on exercise intensity. So you can see that as exercise intensity goes up, we primarily use carbohydrate, almost exclusively carbohydrate, depending if we reach that maximal intensity. Whereas at rest and at very low intensity exercises, we're using majority fat. We never really get to a place where we're using exclusively fat, but we can be in this place where we're using a majority fat. And then kind of at low intensity exercise, you start to use about equal amounts of both. And that's what this chart on the right is showing us. At low intensity exercise, we have about equal contribution from fat and carbohydrate. And at moderate intensity, so as the intensity starts to increase, we're going to use still some fat, quite a bit of fat, but we're going to start to use significantly more carbohydrate because it's higher intensity and we need to have that energy available more quickly. So then this section goes into kind of saying how much of these different macronutrients, like how do we figure out how much carbohydrate, fat, and protein to consume for our activities. So the first thing I want to point out is that for most people, we should still be following the dietary guidelines for Americans that we've already talked about, and any of the dietary reference intake values that we learned about from the National Academies of Sciences. So still following the general healthy eating guidelines. That's how we can support nutrition for physical activity. As we start to engage in more intense exercises, we probably will see an increase in our total energy needs. But for low intensity and moderate intensity daily activities, we should generally be following everything that we've already talked about, because any of the dietary guidelines we've talked about so far were written for people who are moderately active. So it's only once we begin to become involved in high intensity, vigorous intensity exercises on a routine basis that we need to increase our total caloric intake. So of course, athletes would fall into that category. And then these last few bullets are just indicating that the extent to which our energy needs might increase or our macronutrient needs might change are going to depend on lots of different variables. So it's going to depend on sex, going to depend on body shape, body size, and it's definitely going to depend on the type of physical activity, and again, the frequency with which a person is engaging in physical activity and the intensity of the activity. So this would be a good chart just for your own review. It kind of summarizes a lot of what we talk about in this chapter. I'll point out, I guess, a few things. So you have carbohydrate, fat, and protein. What are the purposes, right? Carbohydrate is basically to provide energy. It also says that if we get our carbohydrate from healthy, complex carbohydrate foods, those foods are also going to provide us with essential vitamins and minerals. Fat is a source of energy. Obviously, we've been talking about that. Fat is also important, though, because it can be a means of getting fat-soluble vitamins into the body. Fat includes essential fatty acids, which we must get from the diet. And of course, we also need fat to support healthy hormonal production. Protein, then, is primarily on the backside of exercise. Protein is important after exercise to recover from exercise, build muscle mass, and maintain muscle mass. And then it's really only during intense endurance exercises that we might break down some protein to supply glucose to the working body. And then on the right is a review of dietary reference intake values and the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges. I'll point out this one for protein. So for when we are engaging, if we are engaging in routine exercise, then the protein requirement would go up a little bit. So if you recall, when we talked about protein in chapter 6, we said actually 0.8 is a minimum protein requirement for the body, 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. And here we're saying 1.2 to 2.0 grams per kilogram body weight. So most people who are engaging in regular physical activity would definitely sit on the lower end of this range, whereas really trained elite athletes would likely sit on the higher end of this range. Helpful little review of water here, but I've got a lot of slides coming up to talk about all of this about water. And then I kind of skipped over the top part, but just kind of taking a look at how the total caloric load might increase. Again, more so for people who are actually engaged in, I would say, 300 minutes of activity a week or more and not trying to lose weight. Also a review of a few key micronutrients that are important in exercise. So remember, your B vitamins support energy metabolism, so energy production. Calcium obviously is important for bone health, also important for muscle contraction, nervous system, and neuromuscular communication, hormone function, and transportation of nutrients across cell membranes. Iron, you might remember, is important as that component of hemoglobin to transport oxygen through the working cells and muscles. You can review the RDA for those. Okay, so as I've said, the macronutrient intake for exercise would basically follow the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges. Post-exercise, we want to, of course, consume the protein to promote muscle synthesis, but we do also need to consume carbohydrate to actually fuel that protein, that muscle protein building. Also, after exercise, we're going to be replacing our glycogen stores. So this is another reason why it's important to consume carbohydrate post-exercise, is to adequately recover your muscle glycogen. So glycogen replenishment is actually most efficient in the first 4 to 6 hours after recovery. That's why a good recovery meal would include healthy complex carbohydrate and a healthy source of protein. Again, choose less processed, more complex carbohydrates. Basically choose real whole food forms of carbohydrates. So whole grains like oats, brown rice, wild rice, quinoa, whole fresh fruits or frozen fruits, whole fresh vegetables or frozen vegetables. Of course, these will provide carbohydrate as well as fiber, vitamins, and minerals. I guess I'll also say here, some of these vitamins and minerals, recall, are going to be antioxidants. And I've sort of alluded to without really stressing the point that exercise is a stress on the body. So when we exercise, we're creating inflammation in those working muscles. So this is yet one more reason why it's really important to consume unprocessed foods or less processed foods post-exercise, is because these unprocessed foods like fruits and vegetables are going to be a great source of antioxidants, which are going to help the body recover from that high state of inflammation that was caused by the exercise. Whereas if we eat sort of junky foods after exercise, those foods create additional inflammation. So it's sort of like trying to put out a fire with oxygen, right? Or put out a fire with more fire when we eat junk food after exercise. So just one more reason why it's really important post-exercise to still choose healthy foods. This would just be a helpful example for you to compare sort of like an average day of eating, still a healthy day of eating, to on the right side, a day of eating for, high intensity, longer duration exercise. So obviously you can see the calorie load is about double, and you can see kind of the breakdown of the different macronutrients. I don't think it's showing, yeah, it still shows fiber. So, right, still getting a good source of fiber, still keeping saturated fat low. Sodium is a little bit high, but that may actually be okay because, as we'll see in a minute, with exercise, oftentimes we do need to replenish our electrolytes as well as water. I'm going to circle back to this chart, but I'll kind of give an overview of it briefly here. So this is just showing how we would typically replenish glycogen stores on a normal carbohydrate diet, I would say, following the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, compared to if we were to follow a low carbohydrate diet. So what this chart is showing us is total muscle glycogen, and it's over the course of 3 days. So this is showing if we were to engage, maybe this is like a stage race for bicycling. So every day you're going to engage in 2 hours of bicycling, probably pretty high intensity. So of course on day 1, you're going to deplete your glycogen stores, but then if you're eating a healthy diet, you're going to replenish those glycogen stores for the most part. Day 2, you go out for your ride again, deplete your stores, but you eat good healthy carbohydrates, you replenish your glycogen for the most part, and so on and so forth. Whereas in the low carbohydrate diet, because this person isn't eating enough carbohydrates or many at all, you'll notice that their glycogen stores are just continually falling off over the 3-day stage race. And this is particularly important when we consider the intensity of an exercise, because as we just saw, the more intense the exercise is, the more we rely on carbohydrate. So this type of low carbohydrate diet is actually really sort of silly for anybody engaging in, even moderate intensity, long duration exercises. Another sort of for your reference chart, just showing different types of foods, the total grams of carbohydrate per serving of the food, and total calories of the food. We'll talk a little bit about carbohydrate loading, which is also called glycogen loading. This is something you might be familiar with if you participated in high school sports or know anybody who did, or even if you're doing some sport at the college, you might be hearing about this. So carbohydrate loading is an interesting thing because it can have a productive effect when done correctly. And in order to do it correctly, it's actually a 6-day process. So I have a chart on the next page showing us the 6 days and what goes on in those days. So it's actually 6 days of changing both exercise duration and intensity and changing the amount of carbohydrate consumed. The purpose of carbohydrate loading or carb loading or glycogen loading is to try to maximize the amount of glycogen stored in the muscles prior to some sort of event or competition. There are definitely some potential setbacks with carb loading. For one, it doesn't always improve performance. And there may be some side effects like GI distress, feeling really bloated or like heavy, especially in your stomach, and feeling kind of sluggish and low energy. So if somebody were to attempt to engage in carb loading, this is what it would look like. So for about 3 days, for about 3 days, starting 6 days prior to the event, the person's going to engage in relatively high intensity exercise, right? This would fall into that vigorous intensity exercise while eating relatively low amounts of carbohydrate. So the point of these 3 days is to actually deplete muscle glycogen stores. And then in the final 3 days leading up to the day of the race, then the training sort of tapers off, really light, very low intensity training, and very high carbohydrate intake. That's actually not very high, that's still within AMDR ranges, but the point here is to try to now maximize muscle glycogen stores after having depleted them. So that's what it would look like. Obviously, requires pretty paying close attention to what you're doing and paying pretty close attention to what you're eating. A little bit more about how training affects fat metabolism, and then we'll talk about protein too. So I think these are actually all kind of interesting things. As a person becomes more and more trained in their sport, especially for endurance exercises that utilize fat metabolism so much, we actually notice some physiologic changes. So we notice that the person's muscle tissues start to produce more enzymes that are involved in fat metabolism. And we see that those enzymes are more active because this person becomes more efficient at fat metabolism. We'll also see greater amounts of intramuscular fat in somebody who is really well trained, especially in endurance events. We'll see that these people also have a greater ability to pull fats from the blood, to use them as an energy substrate during exercise. And all of this would go along to say that these people tend to also, their bodies do a better job of sparing carbohydrates, even during times of prolonged, intense competition. So not only can we train our cardiorespiratory system and our musculoskeletal system, we can also actually train our metabolism and train the efficiency of our muscles in utilizing energy. With protein, so again, protein is really important after an activity to recover the muscles. We see that people who are engaging in high intensity exercises and endurance exercises, so that could be both endurance exercise and like weight or resistance training, and anybody who's practicing for competitive purposes, these types of athletes will have increased protein needs relative to the rest of us, or relative to anybody who's just sort of recreationally active. So these people would fit closer to the 2.0 grams per kilogram body weight recommendation of protein per day. It's closer to that amount. Again, still consuming high quality sources of protein, so getting a mix of beans and lentils, nuts and seeds, poultry, fish, and eggs. For the most part, most people can get enough protein through food. And again, it's really only going to be in competitive athletes who might benefit from supplemental protein. I do see a lot of like recreationally active people using protein supplements. And in fact, I always recommend that they discontinue use of them because they don't really have a need for protein supplementation at that point. We can get enough protein from our food alone. It's really only in these cases where somebody's really working on intense endurance or building muscle mass and strength that we need such a high amount of protein that it might not be realistic to get it all from food. So now we'll talk a bit about water. A little bit of reviewing of the different functions of water. Remember that water is a lubricant that bathes all of our tissues and cells. Water makes up the plasma portion of our blood, which is a the way that we transport nutrients, hormones, and waste products through and from the body. Remember that many chemical reactions use water or produce water. We have hydrolysis reactions and dehydration synthesis reactions. Remember, we have fluid basically everywhere in the body. We have intracellular and extracellular fluid. We have, your cerebral spinal fluid is water-based. And again, we use water to make many types of molecules in the body. And water, of course, is also really critical for thermoregulation, regulating body temperature. We talked about evaporative cooling in the water and antioxidants lecture. So a few heat and water related illnesses: heat syncope, heat cramps, and heat exhaustion or heat stroke. So all of these come about from being dehydrated and overheated. So usually these are associated with physical activity, not necessarily exercise, but just being physically active in a really hot environment. So heat syncope is experiencing dizziness from being overheated and dehydrated. Heat cramps are like, where your muscle contracts and won't relax. So kind of like muscular spasms, again, due to being underhydrated or dehydrated and overheated. And then heat exhaustion and heat stroke definitely occur on a continuum. In some cases, the symptoms could just look like, weakness, nausea, or dizziness. But in very severe cases, these can actually be fatal. So anybody who's experiencing dizziness, it's worth sort of sitting down, start trying to cool off, right? Put some cold, damp towels on the skin, start to rehydrate slowly. And for anybody who is showing any of the symptoms of heat exhaustion, so excessive sweating, headache, difficulty concentrating, it is really important to get medical attention to that person as fast as possible, and then begin treating them. So trying to cool them down or trying to replenish their electrolytes and fluids, again, because this can become deadly. Symptoms of dehydration, again, some of this we've talked about before, so a little bit of a review. Certainly you would see a decreased ability to do your physical work, so decreased ability to do your exercise well, while simultaneously maybe feeling like you're exerting yourself harder. Your heart rate may also change and increase. Appetite might go down. We would see some cognitive decline, so difficulty concentrating, headache, dizziness, fatigue, and weakness for sure. And then the two urine changes, so you would see decreased urine output, and any urine that you are able to make would be darker yellow or even brown in color. So a little bit here about how to properly replace fluids with exercise. So first of all, I'll write back up here that the baseline fluid intake is 2.7 liters per day for females and 3.7 liters per day for males. So a good starting place with proper fluid replacement is to already take in this minimum amount of fluid per day, because this is the suggested amount of fluid intake with basically just activities of daily living. So any amount of physical activity beyond that requires additional water intake. So this page breaks it down for activities that are 1 hour or less, replenish with water. Activities that are longer than 1 hour, so 1 hour or longer, you're going to want to replenish with water, electrolytes, and potentially even a small amount of glucose. So the amount and the extent to which a person would replenish with electrolytes and glucose depends on many different factors. So of course would depend on the duration, the intensity of the activity, actually the fitness level of the person, so how physically fit they were, how well physically adapted they were to both the activity and the environment. The conditions of the environment will influence this, whether it's cool or whether it's hot, whether it's humid, whether it's dry. and of course the amount that this person is sweating. Really important to consume fluids before, during, and after exercise. It is not okay to only start drinking your water after you've exercised, because that means you've just forced your body through all this stress in an already dehydrated state. So you put yourself at a much greater risk for developing any of those aforementioned illnesses or any of those symptoms of dehydration. So really, really important to always be well hydrated, hydrate more during your exercise, hydrate more after your exercise. It's important not to rely on your thirst mechanism because it isn't always reliable. Your body may not be able to signal to you just how thirsty you are. So it's important to have a plan for staying hydrated and sticking to that plan. This is a couple of pages just going over the recommendations for how to properly hydrate yourself before, during, and after exercise. And up top, I just want to point out, so for people who are being active in a cool environment, the fluid requirements are in the ballpark of 3 to 6 liters per day. People who are being active in a warm environment, the fluid requirement almost doubles, 5 to 10 liters per day. And so then I'll just highlight a few things. Again, before an exercise or a competition, again, stay well hydrated. So even 24 hours before the event, we should be, even 24 hours before the event, we should be well hydrated. And then during the event, you want to drink small amounts, just before, drink small amounts of water to maintain adequate hydration without overwhelming the body with, a whole bunch of water. And then, of course, during exercise or competition, the amount that a person is going to drink and even the rate at which they're going to drink water will again depend on some of those factors that we mentioned on the previous slide. And then after exercise, we should replenish with about 3 cups of fluid for every pound of body weight lost. And again, one of the things you can do to check to make sure you're well hydrated is checking on your urine color. Just revisiting these vitamins and minerals that are important during exercise, your B vitamins, calcium, iron, and one more I added here is magnesium. This is really important post-exercise to help your muscles actually relax. Also supports healthy neuromuscular communication. Again, for the most part, these can be met with a healthy diet. Would really only be, supplementation would really only be necessary for people who are, again, engaging in high intensity, long duration activities on a routine basis, like 5 to 6 days a week. And then we end chapter 14 with just a little commentary on ergogenic aids. So ergogenic aids are substances that are suggested to improve basically athletic performance. Many do come with side effects. Many are effective. Sorry, many are not effective. Many are expensive, and most have not actually been well studied. So I list just a few here from your textbook. So this page has 5 different anabolic ergogenic aids. So remember from our conversation on metabolism, we have anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism is synthesis or growth. So these anabolic products are promoted as being muscle strengthening and muscle building. So we have anabolic steroids. These are testosterone-based steroids. They're illegal in the United States. And we know that these come with pretty intense, generally irreversible side effects, such as cancer, liver damage, infertility, and an unhealthy cholesterol lipid profile. Then we have androstenedione and dehydroepiandrosterone, or DHEA. These are precursors to testosterone. Again, little research has been done on these, so we don't know much about their actual efficacy and potential side effects. We have beta-hydroxy beta-methylbutyrate. This is a metabolite of one of our amino acids, leucine, again, associated with muscle growth. This one so far has shown no serious side effects. Creatine, remember creatine phosphate. So some people who engage in short, high burst explosive activities might try to supplement with creatine to try to, improve again strength and performance. And then protein and amino acid supplements, we mentioned these briefly in chapter 13. Again, for most individuals, we do not need to be supplementing with protein and amino acids. My recommendation is reserve these for actual elite athletes who have such a high protein requirement that it becomes very difficult to actually eat enough food to meet that protein requirement. But for your average person engaging in recreational activities, amino acid supplements are not necessary. And then this page lists a few ergogenic aids that are meant to increase energy levels. So not necessarily used to build strength or build muscle mass, but to actually help with energy levels. So caffeine and ephedra are two, maybe caffeine I think would be very commonly used, ephedra as well. And then carnitine, remember carnitine is one of those molecules that's important for getting fatty acids into our working cells. Chromium supports insulin's job of getting glucose into the cells. So both of these would help support metabolism, support our ability to produce energy. Beta-alanine and sodium bicarbonate. These are two pH buffers. So beta-alanine works in the muscles. Sodium bicarbonate works in the blood to help keep pH at a, that healthy, just above neutral pH level, just slightly basic. And that's important because as we're going through exercise, many of the byproducts that we're producing may be throwing off the acidity or the alkalinity or the pH of the blood. So these buffers are helpful to neutralize the pH. And then lastly, we have nitrate. Nitrate, I think, is an interesting one because it's actually relatively available just in our diet. But when we ingest nitrate, we produce something called nitric oxide. And nitric oxide basically supports our metabolism. So it allows us to basically, it seems to improve endurance and improves a person's tolerance to exercise. As I said, it's somewhat abundant in our diet. Again, we would have to be eating whole unprocessed vegetables, but beetroot, beets, and even dark leafy greens like kale and spinach, these are actually good sources of nitrate. So you can add those to your diet if you're interested. Okay, so that's it for chapter 14. Again, my apologies for the little mishap with the first recording, but hopefully it was easy enough to just transfer over here and finish up. I'll scroll through these review questions so you have them. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.